At 2:17 in the morning, Sarah Mitchell made the kind of decision that most people spend their entire lives hoping they'll never have to make. She wasn't running towards something, she was running away. Away from the house she once believed would become her home. Away from the marriage she once believed would last forever. Away from a man who had spent years convincing her that she was powerless, isolated, and completely dependent on him. As rain hammered against the windshield of her aging sedan, Sarah gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded against her chest with a force that almost made it difficult to breathe. Every pair of headlights in her rearview mirror looked like Daniel. Every car that changed lanes seemed suspicious. Every passing minute felt borrowed. She had imagined this moment countless times, yet now that it was finally happening, all she felt was fear. Not relief, not freedom, fear. Because Sarah knew something that many people never fully understand. The most dangerous moment in an abusive relationship is often the moment someone tries to leave. For years, Daniel Mitchell had controlled nearly every aspect of her life. He controlled where she went. He controlled who she spoke to. He controlled how money was spent. He controlled what version of reality existed inside the walls of their home. To outsiders, Daniel appeared successful, confident, even charming. Neighbors waved when he walked past. Co-workers respected him. Friends described him as dependable. The version of Daniel that the world saw and the version Sarah experienced behind closed doors were two completely different people. And that difference had nearly destroyed her. But on this night, she refused to become another chapter in a story written by someone else. She drove through the darkness without a destination in mind. All she knew was that she needed distance. Distance from Daniel. Distance from the fear. Distance from the life she could no longer endure. What Sarah didn't know was that less than 12 hours later, she would unknowingly cross paths with a man whose reputation had spread through criminal circles for decades. A man whose name appeared in investigative reports, federal intelligence briefings, and whispered conversations among people who knew better than to speak too loudly. A man associated with power, violence, loyalty, and secrets. A man named Vincent Moretti. The irony is that while Sarah was terrified of the monster she knew, she had no idea that fate was quietly moving her toward another man whom many considered far more dangerous. Yet if events unfolded differently that day, Sarah Mitchell might never have survived what came next. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Sarah found herself driving through a storm in the middle of the night, we need to go back several years, long before fear became a daily part of her life. Long before she learned how quickly love can become control. Long before she realized that some of the most dangerous people don't look dangerous at all. Sarah grew up in a quiet American town where most people knew one another by name. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't connected. She wasn't searching for excitement or adventure. What she wanted was simple. Stability. Family. Security. The kind of future that millions of Americans imagine when they're young. Friends described her as thoughtful and hardworking. She volunteered when people needed help. She stayed close to her family. She avoided drama whenever possible. If someone had told her during those years that one day she would become entangled in a chain of events involving organized crime, law enforcement investigations, and a desperate fight for survival, she would have laughed and dismissed it as impossible. Then she met Daniel Mitchell. The first time they crossed paths, Daniel made an impression immediately. He carried himself with confidence. He seemed ambitious, focused, mature. He remembered details from conversations and asked thoughtful questions. Sarah felt seen, appreciated, respected. Their relationship moved quickly, but not unusually quickly. They shared dinners, weekend trips, long conversations about the future. Daniel spoke often about building a life together. He talked about financial security, home ownership, and raising a family. To Sarah, he seemed like the answer to years of uncertainty. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to imagine a future that felt safe. The earliest warning signs appeared quietly, so quietly in fact, that Sarah barely noticed them. Daniel disliked certain friends. He questioned why she spent time with particular people. He wanted to know where she was going and when she would return. Whenever Sarah expressed concern, Daniel always had an explanation. He said he worried about her safety. He said he cared. He said he loved her. And because she trusted him, she accepted those explanations. Many abusive relationships begin exactly this way. Control rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in small pieces. Small enough that each individual piece feels reasonable. Small enough that the victim adjusts without realizing what's happening. As months turned into years, those small pieces began forming something much larger. Sarah spent less time with friends. She called family members less frequently. Daniel became increasingly involved in every decision she made. He reviewed finances. He questioned purchases. He criticized people she trusted. Whenever disagreements occurred, he somehow found a way to make Sarah feel responsible. If Daniel became angry, Sarah must have done something wrong. If Daniel lashed out, Sarah must have provoked him. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began losing confidence in her own judgment. The first time Daniel became physically violent, he apologized almost immediately. He blamed stress, work pressure, financial concerns. He promised it would never happen again. Sarah wanted to believe him. People often imagine that abuse victims leave immediately after the first violent incident, but reality is far more complicated. Relationships are built on memories, hope, emotional bonds, and promises. Sarah remembered the man she thought Daniel had been. She convinced herself that version still existed somewhere beneath the anger. She told herself things would improve. She told herself everyone makes mistakes. They didn't improve. Over time, the violence became only one part of a larger system of control. Fear settled into every corner of daily life. Sarah learned how to monitor Daniel's moods. She learned which topics triggered arguments. She learned how to remain silent when she wanted to speak. She learned how to survive. And survival became her primary goal. Yet even as Daniel tightened his grip on her life, another story was unfolding hundreds of miles away. A story Sarah knew nothing about. A story involving a man whose influence extended across state lines and whose name carried weight in places most ordinary citizens never see. Vincent Moretti had spent decades building a reputation that blurred the line between fact and legend. Depending on who you asked, he was either a criminal mastermind, a businessman with dangerous associates, or something in between. Rumors followed him everywhere. Stories circulated about deals conducted behind closed doors, favors exchanged between powerful people, and conflicts that ended with certain individuals disappearing from public view altogether. Very little could be proven, even less could be confirmed. Yet investigators continued tracking his activities year after year. At this stage, Vincent Moretti and Sarah Mitchell existed in entirely separate worlds. Their lives had never intersected. Their paths had never crossed. There was no reason to believe they ever would. But history has a strange way of connecting people through circumstances neither could predict. And while Sarah was fighting to survive her marriage, forces were already moving that would eventually place her directly in Vincent's orbit. The turning point came on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Sarah arrived home later than expected after spending extra time at work. Daniel was waiting. At first, he seemed calm. Then he began asking questions. Why was she late? Who had she spoken to? Why hadn't she answered his message immediately? The conversation escalated rapidly. By the end of the night, Sarah found herself sitting alone in the bathroom, staring at her reflection and realizing something she had resisted admitting for years. If she stayed, there was a genuine possibility she might not survive. The thought terrified her because it transformed escape from an option into a necessity. Over the following weeks, Sarah began preparing in secret. She opened a hidden savings account. She stored emergency cash where Daniel would never think to look. She gathered important documents one piece at a time. Every action carried enormous risk. If Daniel discovered her plans, the consequences could be catastrophic. Yet she continued, day after day, week after week, quietly building a path toward freedom. What Sarah didn't know was that Daniel had begun changing too. The closer she moved toward escape, the more unpredictable he became. He seemed suspicious, restless, watchful. At times it felt as though he could sense something shifting beneath the surface. Several times she considered abandoning the plan entirely. Several times fear nearly convinced her that staying was safer than leaving. Then something happened that erased any remaining doubt. One evening, Daniel made a threat that Sarah could not ignore. The words themselves were spoken calmly, almost casually, but the meaning behind them chilled her. For the first time, Sarah truly believed Daniel was capable of anything. And once that realization took hold, there was no going back. The escape had to happen. Soon. Very soon. What she couldn't possibly know was that the night she finally left would trigger a chain reaction involving criminals, investigators, secrets hidden for decades, and a man whose name inspired fear in people far more dangerous than Daniel Mitchell. And the countdown had already begun. The countdown ended 3 nights later. Sarah barely slept during those final 72 hours. Every conversation with Daniel felt dangerous. Every glance he gave her seemed to carry suspicion. She found herself wondering whether he somehow knew, whether he had discovered the hidden cache, whether he had found the copies of her documents, whether he was simply waiting for the right moment to confront her. Fear has a way of changing how time feels. Minutes become hours. Hours become days. Every ordinary moment feels loaded with significance. Sarah moved through the house, like someone walking across thin ice, careful not to make a mistake that could expose everything she had spent weeks preparing. The opportunity finally came on a stormy Thursday night. Daniel returned home later than usual. He had been drinking, not enough to stumble or slur his words, but enough to dull his awareness. Sarah recognized the signs immediately. Over the years, she had become an expert at reading his moods. It was a skill she never wanted to learn, but one that had become necessary for survival. Throughout dinner, she remained quiet. She answered questions carefully. She avoided eye contact whenever possible. She waited, and as midnight approached, Daniel eventually disappeared into the bedroom. Sarah remained seated at the kitchen table for nearly an hour after he left. Not because she was unsure, because she was terrified. The reality of escape was no longer theoretical. Once she walked out that door, there would be no returning to the life she knew. No pretending things could improve. No convincing herself that tomorrow might somehow be different. Everything would change. At 2:17 in the morning, she grabbed the bag she had hidden for weeks. Cash, documents, a few changes of clothes, nothing more. She didn't take photographs. She didn't take sentimental items. She didn't take anything that would slow her down. As she stepped outside, the rain was already falling heavily. The sound covered her movements. For the first time in years, luck seemed to be on her side. Minutes later, she was gone. Mile after mile disappeared beneath her tires. The farther she drove, the more conflicted she felt. Part of her expected relief. Instead, she felt guilt, then fear, then uncertainty, then guilt again. Abusive relationships leave scars that often remain long after the physical danger ends. Daniel had spent years convincing Sarah that she couldn't survive without him. Years convincing her that nobody else would care about her. Years convincing her that every problem in their marriage was somehow her fault. Even as she escaped, part of her still heard his voice. Part of her still questioned herself. Part of her still wondered if she was making a mistake. The sun began rising several hours later. Sarah had crossed into another state by then. She stopped only once to refuel. She paid cash, avoided eye contact, returned to her vehicle, and kept driving. The plan had always been simple. Keep moving. Find a motel. Rest. Figure out the next step. But simple plans often collide with complicated realities. Around noon, exhaustion began catching up with her. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep. Her concentration drifted. Several times, she realized she had driven miles without remembering the road behind her. Eventually, she exited the highway and entered a small town she had never visited before. It was the kind of place most travelers barely notice. A few restaurants, a gas station, a grocery store, an aging motel standing beside the highway. Sarah pulled into the parking lot and sat silently behind the wheel. She had made it. At least for now. The motel wasn't impressive, but she didn't care. All she wanted was a locked door and a few hours of sleep. Inside the lobby, the clerk barely looked up as she checked in. Within minutes, she was walking toward a room at the far end of the property. For the first time since leaving, she allowed herself to breathe. Maybe Daniel hadn't followed her. Maybe she had enough distance. Maybe things would finally get better. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. Then her phone rang. Sarah froze. Nobody should have been calling. Very few people knew she had left. Slowly, she looked at the screen. Her blood ran cold. Daniel? For several seconds, she simply stared. The phone continued vibrating. Again, and again, and again. When it finally stopped, another notification appeared. Then another. Then another. Voicemail, text messages, missed calls. Dozens of them. Daniel had discovered she was gone. The messages began predictably. Where are you? Call me. We need to talk. Then they changed. Why are you doing this? You can't hide forever. You belong here. By the end, the messages no longer sounded desperate. They sounded angry. Sarah turned the phone off immediately, but the damage was done. The illusion of safety vanished. Daniel knew, and if he knew she had escaped, he would almost certainly try to find her. The question wasn't whether he would come looking. The question was how far he was willing to go. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Daniel Mitchell was experiencing a different kind of panic. Neighbors would later remember seeing him leave the house repeatedly that afternoon. Friends described him as agitated. Investigators would eventually learn that he spent hours making calls, contacting acquaintances, and searching for information. Because Daniel wasn't simply angry, he was afraid. At the time, nobody understood why, not even Sarah. There were secrets Daniel had never shared. Secrets that stretched far beyond the walls of their marriage. Secrets connected to financial transactions, questionable business relationships, and people whose names rarely appeared in public records. And one of those names was Vincent Moretti. The connection was indirect, at least at first, but it existed, and before long, it would place all three of them on a collision course. Late that evening, Sarah left the motel room in search of food. She had barely eaten in nearly 24 hours. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets wet and nearly empty. Across the road sat a small diner, illuminated by a flickering neon sign. It looked harmless, ordinary, forgettable. Sarah crossed the street and stepped inside. There were only a handful of customers, a truck driver seated near the window, an elderly couple sharing coffee, two men in work uniforms finishing dinner, and one older gentleman sitting alone in a corner booth. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about him. Gray hair, dark suit, calm expression, a newspaper folded neatly beside his coffee. Yet something about him drew attention, not because he was loud, because everyone else seemed unusually aware of his presence. The waitress greeted him differently. The manager checked on him personally. Several customers glanced in his direction before quickly looking away. Sarah noticed it immediately, but she was too exhausted to think much about it. She ordered coffee and a sandwich and sat quietly near the counter. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then her phone vibrated. Somehow, despite being turned off, she had forgotten to disable the emergency notification settings. A new message appeared on the screen. It was from Daniel, and this one was different. The words were short, cold, terrifying. "I know you're running." Sarah's hands began shaking. The phone slipped from her fingers and struck the floor. The sound echoey brown. Of Arawat through the diner. Several people looked over. T, the man in the corner booth. Their eyes to groused. Sarah, briefly. Then he returned to his coffee. Sarah bent down quickly and retrieved the phone. Tty rit t. Try. He wanted to leave immediately, but her legs felt weak. Her breathing became shallow. For the first time since escaping, panic threatened to overwhelm her. And that was when the older man stood up. He walked calmly toward the register, paid his bill, then paused beside her table. What happened next would alter the course of Sarah Mitchell's life forever, because the stranger standing beside her wasn't simply another customer. He wasn't a businessman, he wasn't a traveler, and he certainly wasn't an ordinary man. His name was Vincent Moretti, and in certain circles, that name carried enough weight to make hardened criminals change their plans, abandon deals, and disappear without asking questions. The most surprising part? Sarah still had absolutely no idea who he was, and neither did the danger that was already moving toward them both. Sarah didn't know why the stranger had stopped beside her table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The diner seemed unusually quiet. Not silent, just quiet enough for Sarah to become aware of every small sound around her. The hum of a refrigerator behind the counter, the clink of silverware against a plate, the distant rumble of trucks moving along the highway outside. The older man glanced briefly at the phone in her hand, then at the expression on her face. Years later, Sarah would struggle to explain exactly what happened during those few seconds. There was nothing threatening about the man standing beside her. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that should have immediately captured her attention. Yet there was something unmistakable about him. A calmness. The kind of calmness that comes from someone who has spent a lifetime navigating situations most people would find terrifying. "You look like someone who's carrying a problem," he said. The words were simple, almost casual, But after everything Sarah had experienced during the previous 24 hours, they hit harder than she expected. She forced a weak smile. "I'm fine." The stranger nodded slightly. It was the kind of nod that suggested he knew she wasn't telling the truth. Then he surprised her. Most people who are fine don't look over their shoulder every 30 seconds. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She hadn't realized anyone had noticed. The stranger pulled out the chair across from her. "Mind if I sit for a minute?" Under normal circumstances, Sarah would have declined immediately. She didn't know him. She wasn't interested in conversation. She certainly wasn't interested in discussing her personal problems with a stranger. But these weren't normal circumstances. She felt isolated, exhausted, frightened, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she didn't feel threatened by him. The man sat down. For a few moments, neither spoke. Then he asked a question. "Are you running from somebody?" Sarah looked away. The answer was obvious, even without words. The bruises Daniel had left were difficult to hide completely. The fear was impossible to hide. She considered lying. Instead, she simply nodded. The stranger leaned back slightly, not surprised, not shocked, almost as if he had expected the answer. "What kind of somebody?" Again, Sarah hesitated. Then the words came out before she could stop them. "My husband." The stranger's expression didn't change. Not even slightly. "Does he know where you are?" "I don't think so." "You don't sound certain." Sarah looked at the phone again. The message from Daniel remained on the screen. "I know you're running." She suddenly realized how absurd this conversation was. Why was she telling any of this to a stranger? Why was she sitting here discussing the most dangerous moment of her life with a man whose name she didn't even know? Yet somehow she continued. And for the next several minutes, she shared more than she intended. Not every detail, not everything, but enough. Enough for the stranger to understand what kind of situation she was facing. When she finally stopped talking, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he asked one final question. "What are you going to do next?" Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it again. Because she didn't know. The truth was, she hadn't planned beyond escape. For weeks, all her energy had gone toward getting away. She hadn't figured out what came afterward. The stranger seemed to recognize that immediately. Without another word, he reached into his pocket and placed a business card on the table. No company logo, no address, just a phone number and a name, Vincent Moretti. "If you find yourself in trouble," he said quietly, "call that number." Then he stood and walked out of the diner. Sarah stared at the card. The name meant absolutely nothing to her. At that moment, Vincent Moretti was simply a stranger who had shown unexpected kindness. Nothing more, nothing less. She slipped the card into her pocket, finished her coffee, and returned to the motel. She had no idea that several hundred miles away, the name Vincent Moretti had just appeared inside a federal intelligence briefing. Because while Sarah was trying to rebuild her life, investigators were once again discussing a man they had spent years attempting to understand. Vincent Moretti's story had begun decades earlier. Unlike many criminals who chased attention, Vincent avoided it. He rarely gave interviews, rarely appeared in public, rarely left evidence behind. That was one reason law enforcement found him so frustrating. Rumors followed him everywhere. Stories connected him to extortion schemes, underground gambling operations, labor racketeering, construction contracts, money laundering networks, and more than a few disappearances. Yet proving those allegations had always been difficult. Witnesses changed their stories. Evidence vanished. People suddenly stopped cooperating. Cases stalled. Time after time. Year after year, investigators built files, and Vincent continued operating. To some people he was a criminal, to others he was a businessman. To a select few, he was something closer to a legend. The truth probably existed somewhere in between. One former investigator would later describe Vincent in a way that captured the frustration many felt. He wasn't the loudest guy in the room. He wasn't the guy making threats. He was the guy everyone looked at before making a decision. That influence extended far beyond his immediate circle. People feared disappointing him. People feared crossing him. People feared becoming a problem he decided to solve. And according to persistent rumors, Vincent had solved many problems over the years. Sarah knew none of this. That night she slept for nearly 12 hours, the longest uninterrupted sleep she had experienced in years. For the first time since escaping, she felt something resembling hope. The following morning, she began making plans. shelters, legal assistance, employment opportunities, a fresh start. The future remained uncertain, but at least it felt possible. Then another problem emerged: her bank account. When Sarah attempted to access her funds, she discovered something alarming. The joint account she shared with Daniel had been emptied, every dollar gone. Daniel had moved quickly, very quickly. Suddenly, her limited savings became her only financial lifeline. Fear returned immediately. She called several organizations seeking assistance. Most were helpful. Some offered guidance. Others provided resources. But rebuilding a life takes time. And time was something Sarah didn't have much of. Because Daniel wasn't slowing down. He was accelerating. The further investigators later examined Daniel's actions during those days, the more troubling they appeared. He wasn't behaving like a husband trying to save a marriage. He was behaving like a man trying to locate a target. Phone records showed dozens of calls, messages, searches, contacts with individuals from different states. By the third day after Sarah's disappearance, Daniel had developed a rough idea of where she might be. And once he had a direction, he became relentless. Meanwhile, another development was unfolding behind the scenes. One of Daniel's business associates had become nervous, very nervous. The associate had recently learned that Daniel was asking questions about Vincent Moretti, questions he had absolutely no business asking. At first, the associate dismissed it. Then he learned Daniel had somehow obtained information connecting Sarah's mysterious diner encounter to Vincent. That changed everything, because in certain circles, curiosity could be dangerous, especially curiosity involving Vincent Moretti. The associate made a phone call. That phone call reached another person, then another. And eventually the information arrived exactly where many people feared it would. Vincent Moretti became aware of Daniel Mitchell. Not Sarah, Daniel. At first, Vincent showed little interest. After all, countless people asked questions every day. Most weren't worth worrying about. But then more information arrived, and what Vincent learned caught his attention. Daniel wasn't merely searching for his wife. Daniel was connected to something else, something older, something that should have remained buried, something involving money that had disappeared years earlier. Money connected to individuals Vincent knew very well. The moment Vincent heard those details, his interest changed. Completely. For the first time, Daniel Mitchell moved from being a stranger to becoming someone worth investigating. And when Vincent Moretti decided someone was worth investigating, events tended to move very quickly. Back at the motel, Sarah remained unaware that her life had become part of a much larger story. She spent the afternoon contacting attorneys and researching protective orders. For a few hours, things seemed almost normal. Then she noticed something. A pickup truck parked across the street. The driver remained inside, watching. Hours passed. The truck remained. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was being paranoid. Years of abuse had conditioned her to expect danger everywhere. Still, the feeling wouldn't disappear. As evening approached, the truck finally drove away. Sarah tried convincing herself she had imagined the threat. Then her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. She almost ignored it. Almost. Something made her answer. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then a male voice said 4 words. "We found your motel." The line went dead. Sarah felt every ounce of blood drain from her face. Her hands began shaking uncontrollably, because she immediately recognized the voice. It belonged to one of Daniel's friends, and if they had found the motel, it meant something terrifying. Daniel wasn't far behind. What Sarah didn't know was that someone else had already received the same information. Someone whose reaction would change everything. Because the moment Vincent Moretti learned that Daniel Mitchell had located Sarah, he made a decision. A decision nobody around him expected. A decision that would place him directly between an abusive husband and the woman he was determined to find. And for the first time in years, Daniel Mitchell was about to discover what it felt like to become the hunted. The phone slipped from Sarah's hand and landed on the motel bed. For several seconds, she simply stared at it. Her mind refused to process what she had just heard. "We found your motel." 4 words. That was all it took. 4 words to erase the fragile sense of safety she had spent days trying to build. Every fear she had carried since leaving Daniel came rushing back at once. Her breathing became shallow. Her heart raced. The walls of the room suddenly felt smaller. The locked door no longer felt secure. The distance she had traveled no longer felt significant. Because if Daniel's people had found the motel, then the nightmare she thought she escaped was already catching up. Sarah moved quickly. She packed what little she had unpacked, gathered her documents, collected her cash, checked the parking lot through the curtains. Twice, then 3 times. She expected to see Daniel's vehicle at any moment, but the parking lot remained quiet, dark, empty, at least for now. She considered calling the police, then hesitated. Not because she didn't trust law enforcement, because she had spent years reporting incidents that seemed impossible to prove. Years watching Daniel explain away accusations. Years seeing him transform into the charming, reasonable version of himself whenever outsiders became involved. Part of her feared nobody would take the threat seriously until it was too late. Then she remembered the business card, the card Vincent Moretti had left behind. For several moments she stared at it. A part of her felt ridiculous. Why would she call a stranger? What could he possibly do? And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the card hadn't been given casually. Eventually she picked up the motel phone. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number. The line rang once, twice, then someone answered. A calm voice. No greeting, no introduction, just 3 words. Is everything okay? Sarah immediately recognized the voice. It was Vincent. The realization surprised her. Somehow he sounded as though he had been expecting her call. For the next few minutes, she explained what had happened. The threatening message, the truck, the phone call, the fear. Vincent listened without interrupting. When she finished speaking, silence followed. Then he asked a question. Are you alone? Yes. Another pause. Then Vincent spoke again. Leave the motel. Sarah blinked. What? Leave now. The calmness in his voice somehow made the instruction more unsettling. There was no panic, no uncertainty, no hesitation, only certainty. The kind of certainty that suggested he knew something she didn't. Why? Sarah asked. A brief silence followed. Then Vincent gave an answer that sent a chill through her. Because if they found you once, they'll find you again. The call ended minutes later. Sarah didn't know why she trusted him. She couldn't explain it. Yet she packed her belongings, checked out immediately, and drove away. Hours later, she would learn something that convinced her she had made the right decision. Around midnight, a vehicle matching Daniel's was reportedly seen entering the motel parking lot. Witnesses later remembered raised voices, arguments, questions directed at employees. Several people recalled seeing an angry man moving from room to room, looking, searching, demanding answers. But by then, Sarah was already gone, and Daniel was furious. For the first time since she escaped, his confidence appeared shaken, because every lead seemed to disappear. Every trail went cold. Every attempt to regain control failed. What Daniel didn't know was that another force had entered the situation. A force he never expected. A force he should have feared much sooner. The following morning, Vincent Moretti received a detailed report regarding Daniel Mitchell. The information came from sources Vincent had cultivated over decades. People who knew things. People who listened. People who noticed details others ignored. The report revealed something unexpected. Daniel's financial history contained irregularities. Large sums of money had moved through accounts connected to shell businesses. Several transactions led toward individuals already known to investigators. One name appeared repeatedly, a man who had disappeared nearly 6 years earlier. Officially, the disappearance remained unsolved. Unofficially, many people believed the missing man had stolen money from dangerous individuals. Money that was never recovered. Money Vincent Moretti had spent years trying to trace. Suddenly, Daniel Mitchell appeared, connected to that mystery. Not directly, but close enough to attract attention. And that changed everything. Because Sarah Mitchell was no longer the only reason Vincent had become interested. Now Daniel himself had become important. Meanwhile, federal investigators were reaching a similar conclusion. For years, they had monitored fragments of financial activity connected to organized crime networks. Individually, the transactions seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern that unexpectedly led toward Daniel Mitchell. The deeper investigators looked, the more questions emerged. Who exactly was Daniel? Why did his name appear near multiple unresolved financial investigations? And why had a seemingly ordinary husband suddenly attracted the attention of Vincent Moretti? The answers remained unclear, but one thing became obvious. Sarah's escape had uncovered something much larger than a domestic abuse case. Far larger. Several days later, Sarah found temporary housing through a support organization. For the first time in weeks, she began imagining a future again. A future without Daniel. A future where she could make her own decisions. A future where fear no longer dictated every choice. Yet freedom remained fragile, because Daniel wasn't finished. Not even close. One evening, while driving home from a legal consultation, Sarah noticed a familiar vehicle, several cars behind her. At first she dismissed it. Then it followed her through 3 turns. Then 4. The realization hit her instantly. Someone was tracking her. Panic surged through her body. She accelerated. The vehicle accelerated too. She turned. The vehicle turned. For several terrifying minutes, she drove through unfamiliar streets, trying to determine whether her fears were justified. Then she saw the driver's face. Daniel. The distance between them was too great for certainty. But she knew. Somehow he had found her again. Sarah immediately called emergency services. As she described the situation, Daniel's vehicle continued following. Then something strange happened. A black SUV appeared from a side street. It moved between Sarah and Daniel. Not aggressively, not recklessly, simply positioning itself as a barrier. The SUV remained there through multiple turns, and gradually Daniel's vehicle disappeared. Sarah never learned exactly who occupied that SUV. No police report identified the driver. No witness came forward. No explanation emerged. But when she later told Vincent what happened, he simply listened quietly, then changed the subject. The response left Sarah unsettled, because for the first time, she began wondering how much influence Vincent truly possessed. The answer frightened her. Weeks passed, then months. Investigators continued examining Daniel's financial activities. The evidence continued growing. Federal agencies shared information. Old cases were reopened. Former associates were questioned. And eventually one individual decided to cooperate. The man's testimony transformed the investigation. According to his statements, Daniel had spent years helping move money through a network of businesses tied to criminal organizations. At first, he had participated for profit. Later, according to the witness, he became trapped, too involved to leave, too frightened to walk away. The testimony shocked investigators. But an even bigger revelation followed. The witness claimed Daniel possessed information connected to the disappearance of the missing man from 6 years earlier. Information that could expose several powerful individuals, including people connected to Vincent Moretti. The investigation suddenly became front-page news. Reporters began digging. Questions multiplied. Pressure increased. And Daniel Mitchell realized something terrifying. The walls were closing in. From every direction, law enforcement wanted answers. Former associates wanted silence. Vincent wanted information. And Sarah wanted freedom. For years, Daniel had controlled everyone around him. Now he controlled nothing. Then, without warning, Daniel disappeared. One day he was answering calls from attorneys. The next day he was gone. His vehicle was discovered abandoned several miles outside the city. His phone was missing. His wallet remained inside the car. No sign of violence. No sign of struggle. No explanation. The disappearance dominated headlines. Speculation exploded. Had he fled? Had someone helped him disappear? Had someone prevented him from talking? Nobody knew. Investigators launched an extensive search. Weeks passed, then months. Nothing. Daniel Mitchell had vanished. For Sarah, the news produced complicated emotions: relief, confusion, anger, uncertainty. Part of her feared he might reappear someday. Part of her believed he never would. And deep down, she wondered whether Vincent Moretti knew more than he admitted. It was a question she never asked directly. Perhaps because she didn't want the answer. Perhaps because she already suspected it. Years later, the official investigation into Daniel's disappearance remained unresolved. No definitive conclusion was ever reached. No criminal charges were filed against Vincent Moretti. No evidence directly connected him to Daniel's fate. Yet rumors persisted. They always did. Some believed Daniel fled before investigators could arrest him. Others believed he crossed the wrong people. Still others believed the truth was hidden somewhere between those possibilities. As for Sarah Mitchell, she eventually rebuilt her life. The process wasn't easy. Healing rarely is. But she survived. She found stability. She found independence. Most importantly, she found something Daniel had spent years trying to take from her: freedom. Yet even after everything that happened, One question continued lingering. A question without a clear answer. When a monster saves you from another monster, what exactly are you supposed to feel? Gratitude? Fear? Both? Perhaps that's why this story continues to fascinate people, because the line between protector and predator isn't always as clear as we'd like to believe. And sometimes survival arrives from the last place we expect. Even today, those who followed the case remain divided. Some view Vincent Moretti as a ruthless criminal who happened to help a desperate woman. Others believe he saw an opportunity and used it. And some believe there are still pieces of the story hidden from public view. What do you think? Did Vincent Moretti save Sarah Mitchell out of genuine compassion? Or was there another reason he stepped into her life at exactly the right moment? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure you subscribe, because the next story may be even more unbelievable than this one.